Hi, and welcome to our confirmation podcast or video that we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to be talking about Abraham and the early, what we call the early church, not really the church fathers, but the fathers of faith. Abraham, Isaac, and then a little bit of Jacob going into that story. Um, so we ended with the story of Babel, where things have fallen into not really chaos, but into all these other nations. And God does that so that the kingdom, the people of that time would not be as destructive as the people before Noah. And so he creates all these nations, and time passes. And then finally, God calls someone to faith. And I think this is important to note that the things happen here where he calls Abram. Now, we know him often by Abraham. His name does get changed later on, but it's Abram, and he's called by God to go to this land of Canaan. And that call is rather important as we look at it. And this is Genesis chapter, I believe, 15. 15. But the call begins all the way in chapter 12, where it starts off with God says, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you." And here's the promise that God makes to Abraham. Notice Abraham doesn't make any promise to God, but God makes a promise to him. And he says, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples will be blessed through you." Now, this is important to note as we see the line and lineage of Jesus Christ coming through Abraham. This is the promise in which God says all nations, all people, everyone on earth is going to be blessed through you. And that's the promise of the Savior, the promise of redemption that Jesus fulfills. And what does Abraham do? He leaves. He trusts God, so he does this. And he leaves with his family, Sarah, their servants, the whole entourage of people, even his nephew. And notice here, the promise is that Abram is 75 years old when he leaves. So this promise is that, and they have no children already. And that's important to know, is that they have no children, yet God says, "You're going to be a great nation." So I'm sure Abram was wondering how this is going to be, and that causes all sorts of issues of these stories of Abram and what happens to him. Eventually, Lot leaves Abram and makes some poor choices of his own. But before that, what's important here is that God promises a son to Abram, and Abram is having a hard time understanding this, and Sarah's frustrated because it's been years and they're old. They're beyond childbearing age. And so this is where Sarah gets her servant Hagar to sleep with Abram, her husband, and produce a child called Ishmael. And so it creates this whole tension and dynamic of fallenness. Again, these are heroes of the faith, and yet they're not perfect at all. What we discover is that they're still filled with the same vice and same sin as the rest of humanity. For Sarah and Abraham to suggest and Abraham to approve that idea, thinking, well, maybe through Hagar. And here's the other thing. Hagar was resentful of this because she knew what would happen is that then Sarah would take the child as her own. And so there's all this kinds of messiness and horribleness that is being done. And yet God blesses Hagar and Ishmael, protects them as they flee the family. And he returns and gives a promise to Abraham, hey, you're going to have a child. And even in your old age, and he does. They do have a child. And that child is Isaac. And so we have this story of Abraham and Isaac teaching him, and so much so that Abraham grows in faith to the point where God says, the hard thing, go and sacrifice your son. And the whole story of Abraham and Isaac, especially the sacrifice story, parallels perfectly what God is going to be doing through his son, Jesus. This idea of that Abraham takes his only son, the one that he loves, the text says, takes him up to be sacrificed. The Lord will provide. And just as Abraham, there's this idea that Abraham believed that no matter what, his son would be raised again, that God's promises were true. And so God stops the sacrifice at the last second and sends a ram. And out of that, we see what the promise of a Savior, the promise once again that God will, who does not spare his own son for our sake. And there's a certain beauty in that as we understand the text. We have this story continue to roll on with Isaac now growing up and getting married to Rebekah, and she has two children, twins, and one kind of, again, this family dynamic is not always healthy. One usurps the other for their birthright. And so we have Jacob now receiving the birthright. And again, here's the interesting thing. We begin to notice this trend that it is not by just blood or birthright or like the firstborn, but it is also the promise that God has elected and chosen people. God chose Jacob rather than Esau. We don't know exactly why, but he does. And so we see this, and we see the family fallout sometimes from the family's choices of that. And then, Jacob has his own children, and we'll get to that too. But there's a lot of wonderful stories here of even the fathers of the faith are fallen people. They lead messy lives that we could record almost as soap operas. And yet God's promise to these sinners is true. And God always fulfills those promises. And I think that's the beautiful thing as we see these stories of Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob about what God is doing and has done, and that his promises remain true. Look forward to having further discussion with you all in class. Thanks.